At precisely 0942, on the morning of May 13, 1943, 22,000 feet above the jagged emerald spine of the Russell Islands, First Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh found himself suspended in a pocket of cold, thin air that was about to turn violent. Below him, the Solomon Sea stretched outward like a sheet of hammered pewter. Ahead, emerging from the white rim of a towering cumulus bank, 32 Mitsubishi A6 M3 Zeros carved through the tropical haze in tight, disciplined sections. Walsh was flying a chance Vought F4U-1 Corsair, an aircraft painted the deep blue of midnight ocean, its massive three-bladed propeller chewing through the slipstream, with a rhythmic, mechanical growl that rattled through his boots. He had 3 wingmen somewhere in the cloud deck behind him, but in the immediate geometry of the sky, he was alone, separated from his formation, with his airspeed indicator holding steady at 280 knots and 16 enemy fighters angling across his nose at 10 o'clock high. Inside the cockpit, the air smelled of scorched cylinder oil, stale rubber, and the metallic tang of pure oxygen flowing through his canvas mask. His right hand rested lightly on the control stick, feeling every shudder of the Pratt & Whitney radial engine bolted 6 feet ahead of his instrument panel. The machine beneath him was not beloved by the fleet that had bought it. The United States Navy had already deemed this inverted gull-wing monster too dangerous for aircraft carriers, banishing it to the mud and malaria of land-based Marine squadrons, after a string of fatal deck bounces and blinded approaches had earned it the brutal moniker of the Ensign Eliminator. Its long, bulbous nose stretched so far forward that during a landing glide, the pilot saw nothing but sky and his own instruments. Yet here, 4 miles above the Pacific, that massive nose housed 2,000 horsepower, waiting to be unleashed against the most agile dogfighter the world had ever seen. The lead flight of Zeros peeled off in unison, banking with the effortless, knife-edge fluidity that had terrorized Allied aviators from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea. They were lighter by nearly 4,000 pounds, carrying 20-millimeter cannons that could tear an unarmored wing to splinters in half a heartbeat. Their pilots were veterans of China and the early months of the Southern Offensive, men trained in an ancient, intimate philosophy of aerial combat that treated the dogfight as a duel of pure maneuver, a test of reflexes where the tighter circle always won. They broke toward Walsh, expecting the American to take the bait, to bank hard, pull back on the stick, and enter the turning carousel where the Zero was invincible. Walsh did not pull into a turn. He pushed the throttle through the gate, locked his rudder, and dipped the heavy nose into empty space, accelerating toward 400 miles per hour in a vertical dive that crushed him against his harness. The Japanese pilots banked hard to pursue him, only to watch the dark blue silhouette pull away from them like a stone, drop down a well, completely indifferent to their superior agility. Aerial combat had always been understood as a shared transaction, an encounter where 2 men agreed to dance until one of them fell. But on this morning over the Solomon Islands, that transaction was broken. The heavy machine was rewriting the law of the Pacific sky, establishing a reality where combat consent was no longer mutual. To understand how Kenneth Walsh and his rejected fighter arrived at this threshold, we have to go back to where it all began. Kenneth Walsh was born in Brooklyn in November of 1916, into a world defined by the cold, damp salt air blowing off the East River and the relentless clatter of iron train wheels on elevated tracks. His childhood was not shaped by grand military traditions or private academies, but by the quiet, grinding realities of the American working class on the eve of the Great Depression. In the crowded neighborhoods of Jersey City, where his family relocated, survival was measured in steady employment and practical trade. The air tasted of coal smoke from nearby rail yards and the vinegar brine of local food processing plants. Young Walsh grew up observing the physical labor of men, whose hands were permanently stained with grease and carbon, men who understood how machinery worked through the vibrations felt in their palms rather than theoretical blueprints. There was no poetry in his early life, only the disciplined routine of school, odd jobs to help his parents pay rent, and the distant, mesmerizing drone of early mail planes tracing the gray Atlantic coastline. In December of 1933, 17-year-old Walsh took a step that would permanently detach him from the factory floors of New Jersey. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, not as an aspiring aviator with a golden commission, but as an ordinary private seeking steady work and 3 hot meals a day. His path into the sky was entirely unglamorous. For 4 years, he worked on the ground, buried in the hot grease and oil of aircraft maintenance hangars at Quantico and San Diego. He became an aviation mechanic and radio man, tearing down fabric-covered biplane fuselages, adjusting pushrods, and cleaning cylinder heads until he understood every bolt and cotter pin of an aircraft. During those long hours on the hangar floor, he carried a small brass feeler gauge in the pocket of his coveralls, a 2-inch folding tool stamped with his enlisted service number, used to measure the minute gap of engine spark plugs to within 1/1000th of an inch. That small piece of brass remained in his pocket long after he left the maintenance crews. An intimate reminder that a pilot's life ultimately rested on mechanical tolerance. By 1936, Walsh had proven himself exceptional enough to earn a rare recommendation for the enlisted Naval Aviation Pilot Program at Pensacola. It was a brutal curriculum designed to weed out all but the most precise airmen. A student could fly flawlessly for 40 hours and be washed out for a single bounced landing or an imprecise approach. Walsh survived the attrition, earning his Gold Naval Aviator wings in April of 1937 as a staff sergeant. For years, he flew alongside commissioned officers who held greater rank but far less flight time. When war broke out across the Pacific in December of 1941, Walsh was already a master airman with thousands of flight hours in his logbook, a veteran who listened to an engine not with fear, but with the analytical diagnostic ear of a certified mechanic. In October of 1942, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to Marine Fighting Squadron 124, the newly formed unit chosen to take a dangerous, unproven new fighter into combat. Across 7,000 miles of ocean, in the southern reaches of Kyushu, another young man was walking a parallel path through a very different culture. In the quiet farming village outside Kagoshima, among the terraced sweet potato fields, and the faint sulfuric smell drifting from the active volcano across the bay, a young Japanese youth was preparing for a life in naval aviation. His family was bound to the soil and the rhythm of seasonal harvests. But the imperial radio broadcasts of the late 1930s spoke of national duty and divine mission. He volunteered for the Imperial Japanese Navy's grueling preparatory flight training, known as the Yokuren, entering a system that treated military aviation not merely as a technical skill, but as a spiritual discipline. The training of an imperial fighter pilot was monastic and unforgiving. Cadets were subjected to merciless physical punishment, relentless swimming drills, and hours of balance training designed to forge absolute physical coordination. Those who survived were taught that the aircraft was an extension of their own living flesh, a canvas and duralumin sword to be wielded with the precision of a classical duelist. Before departing for operational units in the South Pacific, the young flyer knelt in the quiet darkness of his family's wooden home, receiving a silk sash inscribed with protective prayers by his mother and a wooden talisman from the local Shinto shrine. He was taught that aerial battle was a contest of personal willpower, an intimate duel where moral superiority and supreme maneuverability would inevitably shatter any industrialized enemy. Neither Kenneth Walsh nor his Japanese counterpart had ever heard each other's names, nor could they have envisioned the remote, mosquito-choked islands where their lives would intersect. They were two working-class sons of different oceans, trained by diametrically opposed doctrines, carrying their small pocket talismans toward a confrontation that would dismantle everything the pre-war world believed about the nature of flight. Every combat airplane is an engineering argument made physical, a collection of deliberate compromises where something precious is surrendered to buy something deemed indispensable. In 1938, when the United States Navy issued a specification for a high-performance carrier-based fighter, the engineering team at Chance Vought, led by Rex Beisel, made an unapologetic wager on raw power and kinetic energy. They chose not to build a nimble, delicate instrument of flight, but an aerial battering ram designed around the largest and most powerful piston engine American industry could produce, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. Displacing 2,800 cubic inches across 18 air-cooled cylinders, this massive radial engine generated 2,000 horsepower, a staggering figure that outmatched any contemporary aircraft power plant in the world. To harness that ferocious output and convert it into forward velocity, Vaught's designers were forced to install an immense Hamilton Standard three-bladed propeller, measuring 13 feet and 4 inches from tip to tip. This massive spinning disc presented an immediate, almost insurmountable structural problem. If the aircraft were designed with conventional straight wings, the landing gear struts would have to be extraordinarily long to prevent the propeller blades from striking the ground during takeoff and landing. Long landing gear struts were inherently weak, prone to snapping under the violent impact of carrier deck landings. Basil's radical solution was the inverted gull wing. By bending the inner wing sections downward from the fuselage and then angling the outer panels upward, the designers placed the landing gear attachment points at the lowest structural vertex. This allowed the gear legs to remain short, stout, and exceptionally rugged, while still granting the monstrous propeller the clearance it needed. Weighing more than 12,000 pounds when fully fueled and armed, the Corsair was an armored fortress compared to its contemporaries. It carried heavy steel plating behind the pilot's cockpit, thick bullet-resistant glass in the windscreen, and self-sealing fuel cells that could take multiple direct hits without erupting into flames. In its wings, Vought mounted 6 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, synchronized to unleash a devastating torrent of heavy lead at a rate of 4,000 rounds per minute. Yet this pursuit of speed and protection bred severe, unforgiving flaws. To balance the massive engine and maintain center of gravity stability, the main 237-gallon fuel tank had to be positioned directly ahead of the cockpit, pushing the pilot several feet backward behind a vast, blind expanse of aluminum nose. During the nose-high landing approach necessary for carrier landings, the pilot could see virtually nothing of the deck ahead. Furthermore, the stiff hydraulic shock struts caused the fighter to bounce violently over the arrestor wires, while a brutal stall characteristic caused the left wing to drop unpredictably at low approach speeds. Navy carrier evaluation boards rejected the aircraft as unfit for fleet duty, and test pilots derisively dubbed it the Ensign Eliminator. Banished from the aircraft carriers for which it was designed, the Corsair was handed off to land-based Marine Corps aviators, operating from crude jungle airfields in the South Pacific. Across the ocean in Japan, chief designer Jiro Horikoshi had approached the same fundamental challenge of aerial combat from the exact opposite philosophical pole. Facing severe industrial constraints and lacking the massive 2,000 horsepower engines being forged in American factories, Horikoshi designed the Mitsubishi A6 M30 to conquer the sky through radical, uncompromising lightness. Powered by a 14-cylinder Nakajima Sakai radial engine producing 1,130 horsepower, the Zero was constructed from a newly developed extra super duralumin alloy that was lighter and stronger than conventional aircraft metals. To achieve extraordinary operational range exceeding 1,500 miles and an astonishing rate of climb, Horikoshi systematically eliminated every ounce of parasitic weight. The Zero had no pilot armor plate, no bullet-resistant canopy glass, and no rubber self-sealing lining inside its wing fuel tanks. Armed with 2 rifle-caliber machine guns in the cowl and 2 potent 20mm cannons in the wings, the Zero was engineered for an intimate, close-range duel, possessing an ability to reverse direction and tighten its turning radius that bordered on the supernatural. These 2 machines embodied 2 completely incompatible theories of aerial warfare. If altitude is understood as money in the bank, the Zero pilot was an aristocrat, accustomed to spending his wealth instantly, knowing his machine could regain that altitude faster than any opponent through pure aerodynamic efficiency. The Zero treated a dogfight as an inescapable physical transaction, an intimate circle where two men agreed to dance until one of them fell beneath the guns of the tighter turn. But armor weight is a conscious decision to survive the first blow, and dive speed is the ultimate power to deny combat consent. In the brutal economy of the sky, a turning fight requires two willing parties. The moment an American pilot refused to turn, the Corsair's 400-mile-per-hour speed and 4-ton diving weight transformed the nature of engagement. The Corsair pilot could choose when to strike, diving from above with crushing kinetic energy, and then use that accumulated speed to climb away untouched, leaving the agile Zero grasping at empty air. Dive speed was the power to walk out of any room whose terms of conversation you disliked. The aerodynamic physics sketched upon the drafting tables in Stratford and Nagoya were absolute and uncompromising. The Zero could outturn the Corsair in any circle drawn in the sky, while the Corsair could outdive and outrun the Zero in any straight line of flight. The crucial question was whether the men in the cockpits understood these physical boundaries well enough to apply them under the blinding terror of real combat. The Solomon Islands archipelago was not designed for human survival, let alone the industrial mechanics of modern air combat. Stretched across 600 miles of the South Pacific like a broken spine of coral and volcanic basalt, the double chain of islands was a landscape of suffocating extremes. Beneath the flight paths lay dense, unbroken canopies of rainforest, rotting mangrove swamps, and razor-sharp ridges rising abruptly into dense layers of tropical cloud. At sea level, the equatorial heat hung like a wet wool blanket, thick with the stench of decaying vegetation, stagnant water, and the omnipresent threat of malaria. Above 15,000 feet, the tropical air cooled rapidly, freezing condensation on unheated cockpit canopies and subjecting pilots to dizzying transitions from sweltering humidity on the dirt runways to sub-zero chill in the upper atmosphere. By the spring of 1943, this remote geographic corridor had become the central pivot of the Pacific War. The bitter, 6-month struggle for Guadalcanal had ended in an Allied ground victory, but the strategic campaign was far from over. Guadalcanal was merely the southern anchor. To the northwest, across the narrow body of water known as New Georgia Sound, commonly referred to as the Slot, lay the massive Japanese fortress of Rabaul on New Britain, defended by hundreds of warplanes, and heavily fortified staging fields across Bougainville. For the Allied forces, advancing up the Solomon Chain toward New Georgia and Bougainville required establishing air superiority over an immense expanse of trackless water. Whoever controlled the airspace above these Emerald Islands controlled the sea lanes, the supply convoys, and the fate of thousands of infantrymen buried in the jungle mud below. Operating in this environment placed an agonizing logistical and psychological tax on the aviators. Missions frequently spanned hundreds of miles over featureless ocean, where navigation depended entirely on magnetic compasses, wind drift calculations, and dead reckoning. There were no emergency landing strips, no friendly coastlines, and no second chances. If a pilot suffered an engine failure or took a single 20mm shell into an oil line, the only option was a ditching into shark-infested waters where search and rescue amphibious Catalinas might take days to arrive, if they arrived at all. Aviation fuel, spare parts, and ammunition had to be hauled across vast oceanic supply lines under constant threat of submarine attack, forcing ground crews to work in primitive conditions, patching bullet holes with scrap metal, and repairing complex radial engines under torrential monsoon downpours. 7,000 miles to the east, on a quiet spring morning in New Jersey, a streetcar rattled down a sunlit avenue, carrying commuters with folded newspapers who read brief, heavily censored headlines about military operations in the South Pacific. In a modest kitchen, coffee perked on a cast-iron stove, completely disconnected from the heat, the rot, and the violence consuming the other side of the planet. By May of 1943, the opposing forces were inexorably drawing together over a tiny cluster of volcanic atolls known as the Russell Islands, 30 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, the first unit to take the chance Vought Corsair into combat, had moved forward to primitive airfields carved out of the mud on the island of Banica. Their mission was to provide an aerial shield for Allied naval movements and intercept the daily sweeps of Japanese fighters and dive bombers staging down from Rabaul and Kahili. Operating from airfields on Bougainville and Shortland Island, the veteran pilots of the Imperial Japanese Navy's 204th and 251st Air Groups gathered their remaining seasoned flyers. These Japanese aviators were hardened by months of continuous fighting, determined to reassert imperial dominion over the sky and crush the new, gull-winged American fighter before it could establish a permanent foothold. The coordinates had been drawn across the map in salt water and jungle canopy. Two air arms, operating at the absolute limits of their logistical endurance, were about to collide in the thin air above the slot. For nearly 2 decades, the tactical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy had rested upon a single unshakable premise. The sky was an arena of individual martial excellence, and the pilot who could turn inside his opponent would always rule that arena. This philosophy, deeply rooted in classical swordsmanship, viewed aerial combat as an intimate duel of reflex, balance, and spatial mastery. The aircraft was not seen merely as a machine, but as a direct physical extension of the aviator's nervous system. In the crucible of the early Pacific campaigns, this doctrine had appeared entirely vindicated. From the opening strikes across Southeast Asia, through the fierce air battles over Darwin and the Java Sea, Allied aviators who attempted to turn with the Mitsubishi Zero had perished in staggering numbers. The Imperial Navy's tactical manuals taught their pilots that every engagement was an invitation to a circular dance, and that no foreign aircraft possessed the lightness or aerodynamic agility to survive within that circle. By the spring of 1943, however, a profound and deliberate intellectual rebellion had taken root among American naval and marine aviators. Pioneers like John Thack and Claire Chennault had demonstrated that survival against the Zero required discarding the traditional dogfight altogether. With the introduction of the Chance Vought Corsair into operational marine squadrons like VMF 124, that theoretical insight crystallized into a ruthless, physics-based doctrine known as energy tactics. The Americans ceased thinking of aerial combat as a horizontal contest of maneuver and began treating the sky as a three-dimensional gravitational column. In this new framework, altitude and velocity were not passive metrics. They were convertible forms of kinetic currency, to be hoarded, traded, and spent with absolute mathematical discipline. The financial metaphor became the foundational rule of survival in the South Pacific. If altitude is money in the bank, then the Zero pilot was a man who spent every single coin in his pocket the moment the engagement began. When a Zero executed a high G, maximum rate turn to snap onto an opponent's tail, it was magnificent in the first 30 seconds, but functionally bankrupt in the second minute. By sacrificing forward momentum to gain immediate angular advantage, the Japanese fighter bled off its precious airspeed, leaving itself wallowing at low velocity and incapable of rapid escape. The Corsair's doctrine, by contrast, was not about being braver or more acrobatic. It was about arriving richer, spending less, and maintaining enough accumulated energy in reserve to walk away from any engagement whenever the cost became too high. At the very core of this American doctrine lay the principle of the denial of combat consent. A classical turning fight is a mutual transaction that fundamentally requires two willing participants. It relies on the assumption that when one pilot initiates a turn, the other must turn as well to defend himself. The Corsair, with its 2,000 horsepower engine and immense diving weight, destroyed that premise entirely. The Marine aviator was strictly forbidden from accepting the Japanese invitation to turn. Instead, he employed the boom and zoom attack, diving from superior altitude, unleashing the devastating mass of 650 caliber machine guns during a brief 3-second firing window, and utilizing the accumulated velocity to zoom back up into the safety of the vertical plane without ever bleeding his airspeed. If the attack failed to score a lethal hit, the Corsair pilot did not reverse his controls to re-engage. He simply leveled out or pushed into a shallow dive, accelerating past 400 miles per hour, fully aware that no Zero in existence could stay within firing range of his tail. Dive speed was the absolute power to terminate the conversation at will. The Japanese fighter, constrained by control surfaces that froze solid at high speeds, and an engine that could not match the Corsair's brute displacement, was left behind in the upper atmosphere, holding an empty turning circle with nothing inside it to kill. Stay with me, because what the Japanese archival records from the Solomon Islands campaign reveal about this operational shift is deeply haunting. Interrogation reports and unit war diaries from the Imperial Navy's elite air groups at Kahili and Rabaul reflect a growing, bitter frustration among veteran flyers. They were the finest dogfighters on Earth, yet they were increasingly confronted by an enemy that utterly refused to dogfight. The Americans would strike like lightning from the high sun and vanish into the distance before a counter-maneuver could even be formed. The Japanese pilots found themselves locked in a war where their supreme artistry was rendered entirely irrelevant by an opponent who treated aerial battle not as an honorable duel, but as an industrial equation of kinetic force. The tactical chalkboard in the ready room at Banica had made the physics undeniable. The manuals had been written, the lectures delivered, and the rules of engagement established in cold, logical clarity. But classroom theory is one thing, and the suffocating terror of a real cockpit is another. As Kenneth Walsh looked out through his armored glass above the Russell Islands, watching 32 Zeros peel out of the clouds to close the trap, the time for theoretical calculation was finished. The doctrine was about to be tested against living steel. Bandits at 10 o'clock high stepped down in 3 ragged echelons between 22 and 24,000 feet. The voice in Walsh's headset was clipped, flattened by the crackle of high-frequency static, but the visual reality was already filling his windscreen. 32 Mitsubishi A6 M3 Zeros, their dark green cowlings gleaming against the stark white edge of a tropical front, were cutting south across the Russell Islands. The Japanese formation held the high ground, carrying an advantage of 3,000 feet of altitude. In the standard doctrine of naval aviation, that altitude reserve meant death for any aircraft caught below. The lead Japanese division banked in unison, rolling into a steep spiral designed to encircle the lone American fighter and force him into a climbing turn where their superior agility would swallow him whole. Walsh did not climb. He did not pull the Corsair's heavy nose toward the enemy to accept the frontal challenge. Instead, he shoved the throttle quadrant forward against the mechanical stop, engaging full military power. The Pratt & Whitney radial engine answered with a deafening roar that vibrated through the steel rudder pedals into the soles of his boots. Manifold pressure surged past 50 inches. Walsh kicked right rudder, hauled the stick hard left, and inverted the 4-ton fighter. He pulled the nose down through the horizon, dropping into a near vertical dive toward the dark waters of the slot 12,000 feet below. Gravity seized the heavy aircraft. In 3 seconds, the airspeed needle swung past 320 knots, then 360, then pegged past 400 miles per hour. The sound inside the cockpit transformed from a mechanical drone into a violent, tearing shriek as the slipstream battered the curved plexiglass canopy. The heavy G-forces pulled the blood from Walsh's forehead, settling it into his gut with crushing physical weight. Ahead of him, the lead element of Zero sliced downward to pursue, their pilots banking hard on their wingtips, expecting the American to level off and begin the inevitable defensive turn. It was the fundamental miscalculation of the campaign. The Japanese flyers leaned into their turns, their light duralumin airframes carving clean arcs through the air, but the dark blue Corsair was simply pulling away in a straight line. At 400 miles per hour, the Zero's ailerons stiffened under extreme aerodynamic pressure, turning its flight controls into lead weights that resisted the pilot's physical strength. The Corsair, built with heavy control linkages, remained rock solid. Walsh watched the pursuing fighters shrink in his rearview mirror. The transaction had been denied. The duel the Japanese had prepared for had evaporated. Leveling off at 9,000 feet, Walsh used his accumulated kinetic energy to pull up into a massive, sweeping zoom climb. The Corsair shot upward, trading speed for altitude at a rate no turning fighter could match. Within 20 seconds, Walsh was back at 18,000 feet, holding a pocket of reserve energy while the Zeros below were scattered across the lower sky, their engines screaming as they fought to regain the altitude they had just bled away. Walsh picked his target. 2,000 feet below him, a single Zero was banking hard to the left, attempting to bracket an isolated Marine Corsair fighting its way out of the melee. Walsh nosed over in a shallow, high-speed dive from out of the blinding sun. The closing speed was catastrophic. At 400 yards, the white circular insignia on the enemy wings filled the illuminated reticle of Walsh's reflector sight. At 300 yards, with a deflection angle calculated purely by muscle memory, Walsh depressed the red firing button on the stick. 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns fired simultaneously. The recoil slammed into the Corsair's airframe, vibrating the cockpit and filling the small enclosed space with the sharp, choking stench of burned powder. 48 heavy steel-jacketed rounds struck the Zero every second. Walsh saw the tracers converge across the Japanese fighter's wing root and unarmored fuselage. The thin duralumin skin ripped apart in jagged sheets. The main fuselage fuel tank ruptured, detonating into an orange fireball that instantly engulfed the cockpit. Walsh did not linger to watch the destruction. He hauled back on the stick, pulling 6 Gs, and rocketed back up into the vertical plane. Above him, the sky was a chaotic tapestry of white contrails, black oil smoke, and drifting aluminum debris. Walsh checked his fuel gauges and cylinder head temperatures. The engine was running hot, but holding. Looking over his shoulder, he spotted 3 more Zeros diving on his 6 o'clock position, their wing-mounted 20mm cannons flashing with rhythmic bursts of white flame. Armor-piercing shells snapped past his canopy with the sharp crack of whiplashes. A single 20mm cannon shell struck the outer panel of Walsh's left wing. The detonation punched a fist-sized hole through the metal, tearing away hydraulic lines and causing the aircraft to lurch violently to port. At the same instant, rifle-caliber bullets hammered against the armored steel plate directly behind his headrest, with the deafening clatter of rivets fired into an iron bulkhead. A Japanese pilot in a lighter Model 32 Zero had anticipated Walsh's zoom climb and had positioned himself to fire as the Corsair reached the top of its arc. This was the moment where the philosophy of armor asserted its brutal logic. In an unarmored fighter, those hits would have pierced the fuel cells and severed the pilot's spine. In the Corsair, the heavy steel plating absorbed the kinetic energy of the bullets. The self-sealing rubber bladders inside the main fuel tank compressed around the punctures, sealing the leaks before the high-octane gasoline could ignite. Walsh did not attempt to outturn the attacker sitting 60 yards behind his tail. He slammed the stick forward, jammed the rudder pedal, and dropped once again into the vertical abyss. The Corsair plunged through 12,000 feet in less than 15 seconds, outrunning the Japanese cannon fire through pure mass and gravitational acceleration. Behind him, the Japanese pilot hauled back on his stick, his controls heavy and unresponsive, unable to follow the plummeting American without shedding his own wings under the aerodynamic stress. By the time the Zero leveled out, Walsh was already 2 miles away, climbing back into the sun on a fresh heading. Walsh banked back into the fight, his ammunition counters running dangerously low. Spotting another enemy fighter attempting to reform at 14,000 feet, Walsh executed a third diving pass from high astern. A short, disciplined 2-second burst shredded the Zero's engine cowling, throwing fragments of steel and burning lubricant across the sky. The Japanese fighter rolled onto its back and plunged straight into the waters off Cape Esperance. Slowly, the violent sky began to empty. The surviving Japanese aircraft, their fuel reserves exhausted by continuous combat power, broke off toward the north on their long journey back to the airfields at Kahili. Inside one of those retreating cockpits, the young aviator from Kagoshima looked down through the oil-smeared glass of his canopy. Around him, the formations of the Imperial Navy were broken into scattered survivors. His flight leader's aircraft was gone. 4 of his squadron mates had vanished into the gray expanse of the Solomon Sea. There were no parachutes drifting in the humid air. The sky over the slot had claimed them entirely, leaving only thin plumes of black smoke marking the water. Walsh leveled the battered Corsair at 5,000 feet and set his compass heading south toward Bonica. The cockpit smelled of scorched insulation and copper. His flight suit was drenched in sweat that had turned freezing cold against his skin. In his left wing, the jagged hole from the 20mm shell whistled in the slipstream, a hollow sound that filled the quiet left behind by the silence of his guns. He had engaged 16 enemy fighters, destroyed 3, and survived an ambush that should have ended his life. But as the green silhouette of the Russell Islands appeared on the horizon, Kenneth Walsh looked down at his trembling hands on the control stick and felt only the cold, unsparing weight of what had just happened in the air above. When the heavy tires of Walsh's Corsair struck the crushed coral and packed mud of the Bonica runway, the airframe rattled with an exhausted mechanical shudder. Ground crews swarmed the fighter before the massive propeller had completed its final rotation. Mechanics in grease-stained dungarees ran their hands along the jagged rupture in the left wing where the 20mm cannon shell had detonated, tracing severed hydraulic lines and lead fragments flattened against the armor plate behind the headrest. Walsh unbuckled his harness with stiff fingers, climbed down into the tropical mud, and stood with his knees trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. His ears rang with the percussion of 650 caliber guns, and his mouth carried the bitter taste of dry copper. Within an hour, the paper war began to overwrite the physical reality of the sky. In the sweltering briefing tent, Marine intelligence officers questioned the returning flyers, recording claims that reflected the blurred perceptions of men fighting at 400 miles per hour. VMF 124 claimed 16 enemy aircraft destroyed, numbers quickly incorporated into Allied press releases and radio dispatches across the United States. In Rabaul and Kahili, surviving Imperial Navy pilots reported their own versions of the clash. Imperial headquarters in Tokyo soon issued an official communique announcing the destruction of dozens of American fighters over the Russell Islands, while listing their own losses as negligible, reassuring the public that mastery of the air remained absolute. Decades later, when military historians cross-referenced the handwritten action reports of VMF 124 against the surviving war diaries of the Imperial Navy's 204th and 251st Air Groups, a far more sober truth emerged. Kill claims on both sides had been heavily inflated by the unavoidable distortion of high-speed combat, where multiple airmen fired on the same falling target or mistook a diving fighter for a confirmed kill. Yet the true strategic balance, revealed by the archives, was devastating for Japan. The Naval Air Service had lost irreplaceable human capital. On that May morning, several veteran Japanese division leaders, men carrying years of pre-war flight instruction from China, had vanished into the sea. The engagement marked a permanent rupture in the Solomon Islands campaign. The tactical doctrine of energy fighting and the denial of combat consent had been proven decisively under fire. The Mitsubishi Zero, stripped of its ability to force an intimate turning duel, was transformed from an apex predator into a fragile interceptor struggling against superior horsepower and kinetic mass. The Chance Vought Corsair, initially cast aside by the fleet as an uncontrollable hazard, demonstrated that diving weight and speed could dictate the terms of aerial combat. From that day forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy never regained operational air superiority over the southern approaches to the Solomon Sea. For the young Japanese aviator who brought his oil-streaked Zero back to the coral strip at Kahili, there was no respite. Over the next 6 months, as Allied forces advanced up the island chain, the veteran cadres of the Imperial Naval Air Arm were systematically ground down by attrition, disease, and relentless American fighter sweeps. He would continue to fly until his luck failed, watching undertrained replacement pilots perish in unarmored cockpits, until the unit war diaries ceased recording individual names. The protective silk sash inscribed by his mother and the wooden talisman from his local shrine would never make the journey home to the terraced fields of Kyushu. Kenneth Walsh would be awarded the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary heroism during the campaign, officially credited with 21 aerial victories as the first Corsair ace in history. Yet in his tent beneath the dripping palm fronds of Bonica, as the evening rain drummed against the canvas, Walsh sat quietly on his cot. He pulled the small brass feeler gauge from his pocket, turning the stamped metal over in his hand. He thought not of metals or communiques, but of the mechanics who had set his spark plug gaps and the heavy machine of iron and fire that had carried him home. The Pacific sky had settled into darkness, indifferent to official reports, holding only the cold silence of the sea below. When the guns of the Second World War were finally silenced, Kenneth Walsh did not immediately leave the military that had shaped his life. He continued to serve, flying transport and tactical missions during the Korean War, earning additional citations, and rising steadily through the ranks until he retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1962. Yet when the uniform was laid aside, he did not seek the spotlight or trade upon the honors he had won in the skies over the Solomon Islands. He settled into a quiet, sun-drenched neighborhood in Florida, living a life of gentle routine and unassuming privacy. To the neighbors who saw him watering his lawn in the cool, early mornings, or walking beneath the palm trees in the fading evening light, he was simply an elderly gentleman with quiet manners, steady hands, and an unhurried voice. Few among them had any idea that the modest man across the street had once been the first Corsair ace in the history of naval aviation, or that his name was inscribed on the highest military decoration his nation could bestow. In the small workshop behind his Florida home, among ordinary garden implements and woodworking tools, Walsh kept the small brass feeler gauge that had traveled with him since his days as an enlisted mechanic in 1933. Its edges were smoothed by decades of handling, the stamped numbers of his old service record worn faint against the metal. Whenever historians or interviewers sought him out to ask about the dogfights over the Russell Islands, Walsh gently steered the conversation away from his own actions and spoke instead of the enlisted teenagers who had lived in the mud of Bonica. He spoke of the ground crews who worked 20-hour shifts under torrential monsoon rains, wiping coral dust from carburetors, splicing severed hydraulic lines by flashlight, and setting the precise gap on every spark plug so that an engine would not falter when a pilot plunged into a vertical dive. For Walsh, survival had never been a personal triumph of marksmanship. It was an unpaid debt owed to the tired hands that had tightened the bolts of an iron machine and sent him into the sky with a chance to come home. 7,000 miles to the west, in the quiet coastal villages of southern Japan, the few surviving veterans of the Imperial Navy's land-based air groups grew old in an identical stillness. They tended small family plots, watched the seasonal rains roll across the mountains of Kyushu, and rarely spoke of the violent mornings over the slot. They too carried the quiet weight of companions who had vanished into the blue expanse of the Solomon Sea, men whose youth was preserved only in fading black and white photographs on household altars. Men who had once faced each other through illuminated gun sights, separated by culture, doctrine, and the fury of industrial warfare, were bound at the end of their lives by the same shared memory of a sky that had taken almost everything they knew. If someone in your family flew, maintained aircraft, or served in the Pacific Theater during those long years, share their name and memory below. They deserve to be remembered as living human beings, rather than forgotten entries on an old logistics report. The sky over the Solomon Islands does not remember the doctrines that were written to conquer it, nor does it retain the heat of the engines that once tore across its horizon. It accepted the fire, the duralumin, and the fallen with equal indifference, and when the last echoes of the war had drifted away, it held only the vast and enduring silence of the sea.